Alright, so we've talked about money, what money is, how money is defined, the three main functions of money, and now we're going to discuss how money is created. So we operate in the United States under our central bank, which is the Federal Reserve Bank for the United States. We operate under what's called a fractional reserve system. Only a fraction or a limited percentage of the money supply is held in reserve as currency in banks. The required reserves ratio is set by law for all banks. It's usually the Federal Reserve sets it, and it's usually around 10%. The biggest advantage to this is that banks can create money on paper by making loans, and they lend deposits that are then used by multiple times by multiple banks. So here's an example. Bank A makes a loan of $5,000 to student A for a summer trip. Student A puts the money in his checking account until it's time to pay for the trip, and the money supply is now larger by $5,000, which only exists on paper. Student A will write a check for that trip, and that check will be deposited in another bank, and that's still $5,000 more in the money supply. Bank number 2 is required to keep 10% of the $5,000 because of the required reserves ratio. So that's $500, and then they lend the rest, which is $4,500. So student B borrows $4,500 and buys a car. $4,500 is deposited in the car dealer's bank, which is the third bank we've used. Bank number 3 keeps 10%, which is $450, and lends the rest, which has left us now with $4,050. So we can continue this process through all of the banks until we run out of the initial $5,000, or we can use a shortcut. And the shortcut is the money creation. This is called the monetary multiplier. It's 1 divided by the required reserve. So M equals 1 over RR, which is, and you've been given 10%. So 1 divided by 10% gives us 10. That's our multiplier. So if we have $5,000, which is the amount of the original loan, times our monetary multiplier, which is 10, then we're going to create $50,000 in additional money through lending using loans. So banks create money by making multiple loans. They use the money that's deposited in bank accounts as the loans, and potential loan amounts are calculated through a balance sheet system, or what's also referred to as T accounts. T accounts show on the left side assets. These are things that are owned by the bank that are credible or positive contributions towards the total value of assets or the total items owned by the bank. And the right side of the T account are called liabilities. These are items owed by the bank. So if we look here, we'll see a balance sheet, an example of a balance sheet. And so if you have assets, your assets equals your liabilities plus your net worth. It has to balance, okay? So if we have assets of $110,000 in cash, property of $240,000, we add those together, and the bank's assets are $350,000. Their liabilities, which would be something that the bank owes to other people, would be capital stock, $100,000 of equity, stock shares, and demand deposits. Remember, demand deposits are part of M1. They're the most liquid, and so people can come and say, I'm demanding some of the money I deposited in my account via paychecks, checks, currency, etc. And that gives us a total of $350,000. So we see that this example bank's T account is balanced. Okay, so demand deposits, those are checkable deposits. This is the right side, the liabilities of the T account. Checkable deposits, demand deposits, cash deposits that are owned by the account holders and can be withdrawn at will. And owner's equity or stock shares, those are the value of stocks held by public ownership of bank shares. So if a bank is a publicly traded bank, it's owned by stockholders. The basic concept for a T account is liabilities. So if demand deposits come from cash holdings, there's no change in the money supply. Cash is just changing locations within the money supply. If demand deposits comes from the purchase of bonds by the Fed, then it's new cash. There is now an increase in the money supply due to the Fed creating new money. So we have T account assets on the left side. These are the required reserves. It's the amount of deposits that have to be held in a vault available to depositors. The excess reserves, the amount available for loans, and you calculate the excess reserves by taking the demand deposits, subtracting the required reserves, and that gives you excess reserves. Bank property would be their capital, the value of their building and fixtures. Securities are federal bonds that are purchased by the banks, which can be sold and become cash that is part of excess reserves. And then customer loans. That's money that's owed to the bank. So all deposits are called actual reserves, and then you subtract actual reserves minus required reserves, which are your assets, and that gives you excess reserves, which is the amount of money the bank can lend and is considered an asset to the bank. So you have $10,000 in reserves, $40,000 in loans, property is $250,000, so your total assets for this particular bank would be $300,000. Your total liabilities would be the demand deposits of $50,000 and the capital stock, which would be $250,000, which is the total of demand deposits and capital stock equals $300,000. So why do banks lend money? Because banks want to create profit. Profit for banks comes from lending their excess reserves and earning interest on their payments. That's the reason why banks have an incentive to lend money, because they can get interest. It's the fee that is charged for borrowing money. Each loan, once it's made, is deposited in customer accounts. New deposits have to be divided between required reserves and excess reserves, which equals more loans, but because you have to take the required reserves, out first, the loans become smaller. To estimate the total loan amount possible from the first loan, we use the monetary multiplier. It's simply much shorter and much faster process, and it arrives at the same amount. So the monetary multiplier is also referred to as the checkable deposits multiplier, the reserve multiplier, and the loan multiplier. The formula, even though the name can change, the formula is the same. It's 1 over the required reserves. So if the Fed, and the Fed's the one who sets the required reserves, if the Fed says that the required reserve ratio is 10%, then your monetary multiplier is going to be 1 over 10%, or 0.1, which is 10. So 1 over 20%, if the required reserve ratio is 20%, would be a monetary multiplier of 5. So you take the excess reserves times the monetary multiplier, and that will create new loans for the entire banking system, and it increases the money supply with new money from lending. Important things to know about money creation in T accounts is that on the bank balance sheet you have assets and liabilities. Liabilities are demand deposits, because the bank has to be able to give people their money when they demand them, their deposits, and owner equity, stock shares. So those are liabilities because that requires the bank to pay out for demand deposits and owner's equity. Assets, which contributes to the bank's total wealth, include the required reserves, which they have to hold on to, the excess reserves, which they can use to lend money, bank holdings or buildings and fixtures, and securities, which are bonds, and loans, bonds that are offered by the Federal Reserve, because essentially, unless something completely catastrophic happened, you're always getting government securities is very, very safe investment, because you're always going to get your money back. So assets on a T account have to equal liability. So your demand deposits have to equal your required ratio, or your required reserves, plus your excess reserves. So money is created through the monetary multiplier. I cannot tell you that enough. New loans throughout the banking system. New loans is one of the primary ways in which money is created. The money supply is affected by cash from a citizen. Like if I got $100 and I put it in my bank, that becomes a demand deposit, but it doesn't change the money supply because it's not new money. I got the $100 from somewhere else, and I'm only changing the location when I put it in my bank. Excess reserves, then from that deposit of $100 immediately, which would be $90 if the reserve ratio is set at 10%, then that $90 in excess reserves is immediately available for loans. That additional loan would be where the money is created, not from me changing the location of the cash. So the money supply is affected by excess reserves times the multiplier, because that gives us new loans and does change the money supply. The Fed buying bonds creates new loans and does change the money supply. If the Fed buys bonds on the open market, which is open market operations, OMO, this is a new demand deposit amount, and the money supply increases. So the Fed buying bonds, an acronym to help you remember that is BBB, buy bonds, big bucks. When the Fed buys bonds, they're taking the bonds out of the hands of consumers and giving them cash instead. That increases the money supply. If the Fed buys bonds from accounts already held by a bank, the amount only becomes new excess reserves, but it does not change the money supply. So bond prices move opposite to changes in the interest rates. So the price of bonds, if the interest rates go up, the price of bonds go down. Higher interest rates will push prices downward, so that's less in the money supply. Lower interest rates will push bond prices upwards, so then you have more in the money supply, more money in the money supply. And you have to identify the difference between the monetary base and the money supply, because these terms matter. The monetary base is the money that's in circulation plus bank reserves. This is controlled by the Federal Reserve and is smaller than the total money supply, because the money supply includes currency in circulation plus checkable funds. So the money supply is much larger than the monetary base.